A quote from George Lucas: "After Star Wars was released, it became apparent that my story, however many films it took to tell, was only one of thousands that could be told about the characters who inhabit its galaxy. But these were not stories I was destined to tell. Instead, they would spring from the imagination of other writers, inspired by the glimpse of a galaxy that Star Wars provided. Today, it is an amazing, if unexpected, legacy of Star Wars that so many gifted writers are contributing new stories to the saga." End quote. This quote comes from a reprint of Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the first ever publication and installment of the Star Wars Expanded Universe written by Alan Dean Foster. In this quote, Lucas is essentially describing the way he feels about what other creatives have added to his universe, the Star Wars universe. When making his own films, Lucas largely ignored the expanded universe. However, certain parts of the EU he did draw from, such as the naming of the planet Coruscant, which was provided by author Timothy Zahn in Heir to the Empire. Lucasfilm did indeed try to maintain continuity between the EU and the films for a time, but this turned into a much more complex issue when various levels of canon were introduced. T-canon, which is television canon, C-canon, which is what we call legends, in-canon, non-canon, and so on. But this topic could be an entire video unto itself. I bring this up only because it's worth pointing out that Star Wars is unique in that Lucasfilm allowing what essentially amounts to fan fiction to become licensed works created one of the biggest expanded universes of any intellectual property to date. I may be doing a disservice to the creative contributors when I call it fan fiction, but that's essentially what it was. Really good fan fiction, but fan fiction nonetheless. Alan Dean Foster was contracted to write Splinter of the Mind's Eye back in 1976 as a potential low-budget sequel to the original film in case the first film didn't perform well. So I suppose you wouldn't call that fan fiction. But when it comes to the multi-season animated shows, over 300 published novels, over 100 video games, and thousands of comics, it's safe to say that Lucasfilm allowed passionate fans to really let their creativity run wild when creating content based around the Star Wars universe. Obviously, other intellectual properties have spin-offs in the form of books, shows, films, etc., but a lot of the magic that was Star Wars came from the minds of the fandom. The discussions, the EU, the speculating about what might come next. I remember when The Force Awakens was released, before we knew what Disney was about to do to Star Wars. Even though the film wasn't particularly good at all, it brought that back in the fandom. Huge discussions online about who Rey was, who her parents might be, who Snoke was, what have you. Obviously, the sequel trilogy burned us, but this kind of passion amongst the fandom was always what made Star Wars great. And I think in its attempts to contribute to the Star Wars universe, Disney might have missed that. Disney acquired Lucasfilm back in 2012 for $4 billion. Given what Disney had begun to do with Marvel, this was considered a steal. They bought Marvel in 2009 for $4 billion as well, and as we know, they made their money back, then some, almost immediately. So seemingly the sky was the limit in terms of what they could do with Star Wars. But then, Kathleen Kennedy was promoted to president of Lucasfilm, and little did we know that this would be the catalyst for the ruin of the Star Wars franchise.
I remember Kathy came into the room with her steno pad and her pencil, and she was horrible at taking notes, and she was terrible at, she didn't really know how to do it very well. But what she did know how to do was interrupt somebody in mid-sentence. We'd be pitching ideas back and forth, and Kathy, who's supposed to be writing these ideas down, suddenly put her pencil down and would say something like, "And what if he didn't get the girl, but instead..."
To make a long story short, Kathleen Kennedy made Star Wars nearly unrecognizable. She had worked as a producer, and an incredibly successful one at that, prior to being made president of Lucasfilm, but as a producer, she failed to put the right people in the right places to make a good Star Wars product. I tend to believe what happened with Rogue One was simply dumb luck. In a famously bad take, Kennedy was quoted as saying, "Every one of these movies is a particularly hard nut to crack. There's no source material. We don't have comic books. We don't have 800-page novels. We don't have anything other than the passionate storytellers who get together and talk about what the next iteration might be," end quote. Just let that sink in. Quote, "There's no source material. We don't have comic books. We don't have 800-page novels." This statement alone proves how little Kennedy knows about Star Wars. TV shows, over 300 novels, video games, thousands of comics, she simply doesn't know anything about the property she's been tasked with heading up. She also put the wrong people in the wrong places, such as J.J. Abrams, who worked on episodes 7 and 9, basically just made Lost in Space. And I don't mean the 1965 TV show Lost in Space, I mean the show Lost, which J.J. Abrams created, but in the Star Wars universe. And we all know what Rian Johnson did to episode 8. But instead of diving too deep into everything that went wrong with Disney's version of Star Wars, let's talk about the fans. Because the fans are the ones paying the bills after all. Fan reception to the sequel trilogy, the Disney Plus shows, and just Disney Star Wars as a whole was not good. The Star Wars fandom has been labeled the fandom menace for their harsh critiques of modern Star Wars projects. But it doesn't make fans a menace to have expectations. Expectations that their favorite IP isn't going to get dragged through the mud. Expectations that the creatives put the same love and care into the projects as the creatives behind the EU did. Kathleen Kennedy made comments in the past about how Star Wars had been male-dominated for far too long, going on to speak about her attempts at bringing new fans into the fandom, such as women, young people, etc. These comments came off as pretty flippant toward men who were implied as being dorky for liking Star Wars, even though they were the entire reason the brand had stayed alive for so long. Obviously, Star Wars is for everybody, but to ignore the fact that the male-dominated fan base is the reason the property succeeded discredits the passion of those fans, and not to mention is a really good way to bite the hand that feeds you. But I digress. In short, in attempts to pander to new fans and other demographics, the Disney Plus Star Wars shows and movies managed to alienate themselves from the fans that grew up with the original movies. They focused too much on pandering to non-fans, instead of making a great product, and in turn, alienated the core audience. In an interview with Conan O'Brien, Liam Neeson, who played Qui-Gon Jinn in episode 1, was asked about fans coming up to him, and it turns out it's not the kids coming up to Liam Neeson wanting his autograph, it's the grandpa, or the dad.
There's so many movies and spin-offs now, I think. No, you're diluting the whole thing. I think that's my personal thing. And but yeah, occasionally, you see, oh, there's kids after the Star Wars autograph, and I don't want to give autographs. We're in an airport. Oh, it's not the kid. It's the grandfather. There he is. Or the dad.
He goes on to talk about how he thinks there's too many spin-offs now, and he thinks it's diluting it and taking away from the magic of Star Wars. But the reason I bring this up is to illustrate that the core audience of Star Wars has been around a long time, many of which since 1977. These are people who not only have been fans for a long time, but they likely read some of the novels or the comics or played some of the games. But instead of adapting a movie or TV show from the EU, from Legends, or instead of taking George Lucas's notes and adapting his idea for a sequel trilogy, Disney decided to let their creative juices run wild, yet possess neither the passion nor the talent to make a decent Star Wars project. Most of them, that is. This fandom has been around a long time. These people know what Star Wars is and what it isn't, unlike Lucasfilm president Kathleen Kennedy. So since it's the newest in a long line of unremarkable Disney Star Wars projects, let's talk about the Ahsoka show. The show that news outlets and critics seem to love. It's only like you'd had to have watched every other Star Wars property to fully understand what the hell's going on in the show. Lore-wise, it's decent, and as a whole, it's better than what we've come to expect from Disney Star Wars. But whether it's desensitization to mediocre content or simply nostalgia, many people seem to think that the show is pretty good. I myself find it to be quite tiresome, just honestly plain boring. The editing is done in such a way that maximizes episode runtime as much as they can, so a shot of Ahsoka walking somewhere, which could easily be a couple of seconds, gets dragged out. It's not cinematic, it's just boring. I'm not going to start listing examples of this, but if you watched the show, you likely know what I'm talking about. Even if it's just a little too much time spent focused on one specific moment, to me, it screams runtime. It also suffers from many of the modern cliches we've come to expect from companies such as Disney. The strong female character who is supposed to be impressive but just comes across as a jerk. I remember watching that scene on the speeder with Sabine Wren where she's being ordered to stop and just keeps going. You can tell the writers thought this was really cool. Like we were supposed to think that she was super cool, but instead, she just comes across as a jerk. She acts like a bully. I suppose you can make the argument that the live-action version shares similar personality traits to Sabine and Rebels and other properties, but she's not an ass. And who the hell thought it would be a good idea to have her steal the map, then lose it to the scary Sith lady, be practically forgiven by the end of the episode, and then proceed to play the role of the hero in the show. Who's rooting for her? I'm not going to keep nitpicking the show, but I hope some of you understand where I'm coming from. It's better than the last season of Mandalorian, not as good as Andor, better than Boba Fett. Honestly, it's just nothing special when it comes to Disney Star Wars. And given that none of them are anything special, that's a pretty low bar. Creativity is starkly lacking from modern film and television. This is broadly apparent when every other movie or show being released is some form of reboot, reimagining, retelling, repurposing of a formerly successful property. Or, in the case of the Ahsoka show, an attempt to profit off the name. Star Wars, Ahsoka, fans know her, right? Make a show, and can you really blame the creatives? Well, of course you can. But, that being said, these sorts of products do make money. And I use the term products very intentionally here because that's what they're treated as, not art, product. Now, the Disney Plus shows are losing money hand over fist because Disney Plus is losing money hand over fist. If you want to know more about that, watch this video here or click the link in the description. But in general, these kinds of reboots, especially when they are released in theaters, do make money. The Force Awakens, $2 billion. Aladdin remake, $1 billion. Lion King remake, $1.6 billion. The Last Jedi, $1.3 billion. And I lumped the live-action remakes in with Star Wars crap because really it's all the same tactic. Use the name to profit, and damn being true to the original work. Movie ticket sales are down 40% since before COVID happened. The theaters never bounced back. So studios are unwilling to risk an original work with an unrecognizable name that fans likely won't turn up for. They'd rather invest in things like Barbie or Lightyear or another Marvel movie because something like that is more likely to draw fans. Yet this is killing creativity. Ironically, the decline of theater ticket sales and big box office returns is a direct result of the studios themselves. These studios who put all their money into streaming during the pandemic, presuming that streaming would be the future of entertainment, now people would rather just wait for something to come out on the streaming platform they pay for than go to the theater, and who could blame them? But that's the irony. By the time these studios realized that there's no money in streaming, it was too late. People had lost interest in going to the theater. But I digress. If you were wondering why the hell all these remakes, now you know. If you spent any time watching my other videos, then you know this is something that I'm really sick of, and many fans are as well. Star Wars needs a miracle to be saved. Actually, scratch that. Star Wars can't be saved, even by an act of God. They burned the fans too bad. The ones who've been around for the longest, the ones that spent their money on not only ticket sales, but games, comics, novels, etc. The ones that passed their love of Star Wars onto their children. They've been burned. Funny enough, however, it seems Kathleen Kennedy and Disney haven't figured out that it's not kids and young adults that were driving the long-term success of Star Wars. It was the long-term fans, and they are gone, or at least have no interest in supporting anything that comes out of Disney's version of Star Wars. These are the guys that wrote the EU, that came up with all the amazing fan fiction that inevitably turned into legends and so on. And these people have no interest in seeing their favorite property burned and destroyed. Kennedy's attempts to win over kids and women and what have you failed. The box office tells us that, and the abysmal non-for-profit organization known as Disney Plus. Star Wars is for everyone, not just the core fans. But make the fans happy first. They're already there, ready and willing to spend their money on good Star Wars. Winning over new fans should be secondary to doing justice by the ones who made the property successful in the first place. That's why they bought it, right? There's this awesome thing called marketing. I'm sure Disney knows all about that. That's what marketing is for, winning over new fans. So many people have come to expect garbage from Disney Star Wars that the Ahsoka show was actually mistaken by many to be a good show. I'm sorry to say, but it's really not. If you like this sort of content, hit the subscribe button. If you want to support the channel, consider becoming a member. See you on the next one.